The CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code was developed to help property developers increase the energy efficiency and the upgradability of their building projects. Energy savings help offset the potential higher cost of building your home to code. And enhanced upgradability helps commercial owners increase their competitive advantage, saving money over time. Additionally, lower energy demands during and after the building process can also lead to community and national level benefits like reduced reliance on fossil fuel generated electricity across the construction industry and in homes, lower national fuel import bills, which can free up funding for other critical areas of investment, and fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So do the maths, play the long game, and help build towards a better future today. For more information on the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, visit energy.crosq.org.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Dr. Gary Jackson, Executive Director, Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, CREEBC. Mr. Zephyrinus Norbert, Director of Energy Engineering Consulting. Mr. Dave Walls, International Code Council Vice President of Business Support Initiatives. Mrs. Dika Straker, Special Projects CROSQ. Representatives of the GIZ and TAPSEC project, representatives of the CARICOM Energy Unit, representatives of CREEBC, representatives of the various ministries of energy of CARICOM, representatives of the private sector organizations and business, technical officers and staff of the various bureaus of standards and the CROSQ Secretariat, media representatives, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning once again to everyone. And on behalf of the CROSQ network, I would like to thank you for joining us here today as we seek to facilitate the national implementation of the 2018 CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, called CREEBC. The CARICOM region, a group of small island developing states located in the Caribbean Sea and bound through formal Treaty of Chaguaramas, is among the most severely affected by climate change in the world. Notably, the region is not a significant emitter of carbon emissions, but is highly vulnerable to the effects of global warming, which is seen in rising sea levels, coastal erosion, intense droughts, increased flooding, and increased activity of hurricanes. To ensure their survival and mitigate against climate change, member states must therefore develop, adopt, and implement national policies to increase the introduction and uptake of sustainable energy solutions geared towards reducing energy uses and consumptions, as well as carbon emissions. However, the lack of capacity at the national level in some member states necessitates a regional approach to the development and harmonization of these policies and measures. This approach can more effectively facilitate the strategic and optimal allocation of resources and exploitation of synergies amongst member states. Thus, the CARICOM Secretariat, through its energy unit as the owner of the CARICOM Energy Policy and the accompanying Caribbean Sustainable Energy Roadmaps and Strategy, has been guiding the development and rollout of the Regional Energy Agenda, an agenda that is aligned with international treaties and agreements, and to which national energy policies are also being aligned. To assist this course, regional institutions such as CROSQ, the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, has assumed significant roles in executing aspects of the strategies contained in the CARICOM Energy Policy. CROSQ is a network of the 15 bureaus of standards within CARICOM. and it's involved in the development, implementation, and promotion of a regional quality infrastructure that itself involves the development and harmonization of standards and technical regulations, the development of measurement or metrology infrastructure in each member state, as well as the mutual recognition of conformity assessment schemes for quality in the areas of inspection, testing, and certification. We're also actively involved in helping laboratories and other conformity assessment bodies to become accredited to international standards. CREEBC's first regional quality infrastructure energy initiative, as articulated in the energy policy and mandated by the 41st Energy Quoted, the Council for Trade and Economic Development of CARICOM, was the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Code, or REBEC. The REBEC was approved in 2018 by COTED, this Council of Ministers, and the code was informed by the following studies: Roadmap for energy use in buildings, the development, implementation, and enforcement of regulations and codes within CARICOM states, development of minimum energy performance standards for public and commercial buildings in CARICOM countries, and finally, the status review and recommendations of a draft energy efficiency building code for CARICOM. All these various studies found their way into one consolidated document in 2018 as approved by the regional ministers for trade, economic development, and also by the separate ministers of energy. And this is called the REBEC, or the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. Now, the base for this REBEC is the International Energy Conservation Code, IECC, of the International Code Council. The 2018 REBEC thus has international status and is published and is readily available on the website of the International Code Council, ICC. And for this, we thank very much Mr. Walls of the ICC and his team, some of whom are with us today with Mr. Walls. Since the approval of the 2018 REBEC, CREEBC and partner organizations like CREEBC have been quite proactive in building capacity at the national level to facilitate implementation readiness of these codes. And in this respect, we would like to thank Dr. Gary Jackson, the CEO of CREEBC, who is with us here today. CREEBC has collaborated with the International Code Council to also develop a curricula to ensure that industry practitioners and code officials are educated on the code requirements. And then we released two supporting publications in this regard: the 2018 REBEC Study Companion and the 2018 REBEC Code Essentials, also available on ICC's website. CREEBC, along with its partners of CREEBC and ICC, we then went one step further and we partnered with the 5 Cs of Belize, and we began training industry practitioners in 14 member states utilizing these two publications. And a major partner in this way has been the European Union through the TAPSEC project and GIZ in support of that TAPSEC project. And also Mr. Norbert, who is here with us today as the director of the Energy Engineering Consultancy firm. And for all these partnerships with the EU and GIZ and with Energy Consulting Firm, we thank our partners who are here today with us. Now, in collaboration with CREEBC, we have started the process of awareness building and promotion of the code in a major way, and hence this webinar here today, which is part of a series. In the near future, we intend to develop national roadmaps for the implementation of the codes, which will serve as a tool to inform policymakers of the exact next steps which are essential to get member states to the point of implementation in a very customized manner. Now, though it is time for this next stage, implementation of the REBEC, implementation occurs at the national level. It is a process which involves the cooperation of several agencies, each with specific roles which range from development of energy policies and supporting implementation plans to legislation policies, the inspection of buildings, and a range of various roles and responsibilities. And that's the importance of us currently developing these energy efficiency implementation roadmaps at the national level. In this regards too, we have invited you here today in collaboration with CREEBC, GIZ, the European Union, and others to be part of and learn more about international best practices in rolling out the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. We therefore thank you for taking the time and effort to be with us today, and we encourage you to join our call to action and to play your part in your respective agencies in implementation of the 2018 REBEC at the national level. Thank you all very much. JL, you're muted.
Thank you, CEO, for bringing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is JL Brown, and I am the project assistant on the TAPSEC project here at the CREEBC. Our moderator for today is Mr. Zephrinus Churchill Norbert. Mr. Norbert is an engineer whose areas of specialty are electrical engineering, energy management, renewable energy, and project management. He has worked in the energy industry for over 3 decades in the CARICOM region and internationally. And Mr. Norbert is the founder and managing director of Energy and Engineering Consulting Services based in Antigua. Mr. Norbert holds a 3-year diploma in electrical engineering from the University of Technology in Jamaica, is a certified energy manager he is also, a certified photovoltaic practitioner and a certified hospitality facilities executive. He also holds a master's in science degree in project management from the University of Salford in Manchester. Mr. Norbert is also an active member of the Association of Energy Engineers based in the USA. He is the chairman of the National Electrotechnical Committee in Antigua and Barbuda and represents Antigua and Barbuda on the ISO Technical Committee 301. Mr. Norbert was the chairman of the regional project team that developed the 2018 CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, and he is also a lecturer at the University of the West Indies Open Campus in Antigua and Barbuda. He is married with 2 children and is an Antiguan by nationality and St. Lucian by birth. Mr. Norbert, I now hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. And a special good morning and good afternoon to every single one of you who took the time off to be with us here today. And some of you, I'm sure, have been following us for quite some time as far as the development process that we have gone through in terms of now having an established CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. So you've been with us throughout the development process, and you continue to engage with us, showing a high level of interest as we move towards the implementation phase, which is one of the most important stages as far as the energy codes are concerned. So welcome this morning and this afternoon to all of you. And in my opening remarks this morning, I just want to reference the National Energy Codes Conference out of the US that I attended last week. It was a 2-day conference from the 20th to the 22nd of July. And so there we see that not only are we in the region aggressively moving towards action in the whole question of sustainability and action in terms of creating a better environment for ourselves and for our children, but we see other partners in the US are doing the very same thing. So we constantly have to ask ourselves, why? Why are we doing this? Why are we so passionate? And why are we seeking to develop energy efficiency building codes and to move into the phase of implementing these codes? So according to the US Department of Energy, buildings are the largest sector of the US energy economy. We can say the very same thing for us in the region, the significance and importance of buildings. The US Department of Energy concludes that energy codes save energy and money for homeowners and businesses, while at the same time reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and as well create skilled jobs. And this helps to ensure that the occupants of buildings are comfortable and productive. It provides an environment in terms of the quality of housing for all. And I just want to quote from Winston Churchill, who said, "We shape buildings and buildings shape us." So as we engage this morning into this afternoon for the next 2 hours, discussing and hearing from experts in the industry, sharing with us the knowledge that they have gathered over the years as far as the implementation, taking the action steps towards ensuring that we can now remove codes from the shelves and do the actual implementation. We also want to reference what the international community is saying. And so the International Energy Agency, the EIA, articulates that over 30% of energy used in buildings are wasted. So there's quite a bit of wastage in our buildings, the buildings that we shape for our future. So how big are the stakes? Again, referencing from the US Department of Energy, they have estimated 138 billion with a B, 138 billion in energy cost savings to homes and businesses over the next 20 years until 2040 through the use of energy efficiency building codes, and 900 million metric tons of avoided CO2 emissions. And we can make the direct linkages between climate change and the greenhouse gas emissions, especially CO2 emissions. We have felt the impacts throughout the region. I would reference again in the recent times, we saw some flash flooding just about a week or two ago in some of the countries like St. Lucia. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we saw the volcanic activities and what, the effects of that were on the people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We could also reference the flooding in Guyana. So what we are talking about is real climate change, the excessive temperatures that we are currently faced with in the region. And so I just wanted to remind us that we must always think of why we're doing what we're doing so that we can continue to be encouraged moving forward. So as we seek to move towards implementation, and as Mr. Omar said, during the training sessions that we conducted throughout the member states of CARICOM, the 14 member states of CARICOM, one of the things that came out was whether there was any analysis done to show the benefits to be derived from the use of energy efficiency building codes. And I was fortunate to get some information from the conference that I attended last week. And the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, the PNNL, they have done some assessments that can be utilized by us in the region. And the assessments will range from various energy codes. But in particular, they have done an analysis in the US for the 2018 International Energy Conservation Code, both for the residential sector and for the commercial sector. So I will share with you a link in the chat where you can now access this information. I'm going to post it right now in the chat. So you can access, if you follow this link, you will have access to the analysis that was done in the US based on the various codes, but you could specifically zoom in on the 2018 Energy Efficiency Conservation Code, which is the international code that we use. And so the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code is an adaptation of that code. So this will give us some sort of a guide as far as what are the benefits in terms of the energy savings and the cost savings per square foot to be derived in both the residential and commercial buildings. And finally, when you find yourself in a hole, especially a carbon hole, you should stop digging. Let me repeat. When you find yourself in a hole, especially a carbon hole, you should stop digging. And this summarizes the reasons why we should, all member states, aggressively move towards the implementation of the CARICOM Regional Efficiency Building Code. And finally, in terms of the energy burden that we are all faced with in the region, if we are to move towards improving economic activity throughout the region, then we have to seriously look at how we can reduce wastage, energy wastage in our buildings. And so I'll leave you with a simple equation that you can use in your respective businesses and homes to analyze what we call the energy burden. So the energy burden is equal to the average household energy cost divided by the average household income. I shall repeat. The energy burden is equal to the average household energy costs divided by the average household income. So, having said that, I would just like to now introduce our first speaker this morning. And before I introduce the speaker, I would just like to go over some of the housekeeping rules that we have. This webinar is being recorded and is being streamed live on the CrossQ's YouTube page. Secondly, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen to type questions and comments for the speakers and maybe for the moderator as well to address. So we would like to have quite a bit of engagement today, as we normally have with these webinars. So we encourage you to ask as many questions as you would like to, so that we could have a very engaging session this morning into this afternoon. So our first speaker this morning is Mr. Dave Walls. And Mr. Dave Walls is the Vice President of Business Support Initiatives for the International Code Council. His responsibilities include overseeing the development of support products and materials related to sustainability, as well as domestic and international business development initiatives. Prior to joining the International Code Council, Mr. Walls served as the Executive Director of the California Building Standards Commission, which oversees the adoption and publication of Title 24, the California Building Standards Codes. In his capacity, he successfully directed the development and publication of the Carl Green, the first mandatory statewide grid building code in the US. Dave has also served as a commissioner on the California Seismic Safety Commission, as a board member of the California Hospital Building Safety Board. Dave is a California licensed general contractor and served as a code official in the building inspection divisions for 2 local jurisdictions in California. He also served as an adjunct professor in the construction management program at the University of California, Davis. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Dave Walls.
Thank you, Mr. Nobert, and thank you for inviting me to participate today. I really appreciate being able to represent ICC and talk about the California implementation process. And I'm sorry, I'm getting my slides up here. There we go. So California, you know, we've been doing it for well, since the 50s that we've actually had a Building Standards Commission, but things have evolved over the years, obviously, as we've learned our lessons. So first, I'll talk about a little bit about myself. I was introduced. Thank you, Mr. Norbert. Yeah, for providing all that. I'll just say that I have a pretty wide background in terms of building and codes. In my last job, I worked for that governor right there, who was very proactive in energy and sustainability, and it was really a pleasure. And that's how we ended up getting CalGreen, which was mentioned. So today, I'm really just going to talk about that broad overview of California and the process that we have gone through for years, through the code development, the laws and regulations that drive it, the application of the energy code, energy code modifications. We'll talk a little bit about that, what local levels can do, and enforcement. So from a statewide application, all the building codes in California apply statewide. So not just the energy code, but we have building, plumbing, mechanical, fire, all of those, even the existing buildings have a code. So, and they all apply statewide. So they're all developed through the Building Standards Commission. And then the state law requires cities and counties to do most of the enforcement at the local level. And let's see here. There we go. There are over 540 counties and cities in California. So there's a large, wide array of individuals that are actually enforcing it. So you have LA City, for example, that has over 1,000 inspectors, plan checkers in their departments, and yet you have a small city that may only have 2 or 3 people that are doing all the enforcement for that city. So, and they all have different backgrounds and different ideas on interpretation and enforcement, but and they're also allowed, all the administrative procedures are allowed by the local jurisdictions to implement the code, how they issue permits, charges, that type of thing, costs. And but there are some specific administrative provisions that the state does require. The local adoption process. So now once the state develops the code and the energy code is again part of that, then the local jurisdictions must adopt it by local ordinance. However, if they fail to do it, because you've got 540 of them, they must do it prior to the effective date. If they don't, the state codes automatically apply anyway. So really, unless they want to make amendments, it really doesn't matter. If it's effective about 180 days after public date established by the state. So when the codes are developed, adopted, and published, then 180 days, and that 180 days is given to provide everybody an opportunity to learn the updates, to learn the new codes, and manufacturers, builders, inspectors, all down through the process. So they give them roughly 6 months. However, if for some reason the state can establish an alternate effective date, so they can actually extend it longer if they want, though I've never seen them do that, but law allows that. And then a city or county can modify the state codes under limited conditions. Also, a fire protection district may modify the California Building Standards Code, again, under those same limited conditions. And you wonder, well, how does a fire impact energy? And one of the things we ran into is in some of the high fire severity zones, which, you see all of our wildfires in California. I'm sure you hear about it way too often. We certainly do. But sometimes, so they increase the requirements in those high fire severity zones, and for example, windows. So they can require specific types of windows, which can impact what the energy code requires. So those things have to be coordinated and ensure that they don't affect one another. Although it is the fire districts are a little different process than cities and counties, but all local modifications must be filed with the state to be effective. So even though local jurisdictions may go through their governing body, be it a city council or county board of directors, they have to present it to them. It goes publicly and still has to be approved by public vote to get the local amendments in place. And then once that's done, they have to file that with the state. If it's not filed with the state, then even though they've gone through all that process, it technically is not effective. The state files the local ordinance within their office, and they post it on the internet so the public can have access to all of it. So one of the reasons why they limit the amount of modifications that are done by local jurisdictions is because they want the uniformity and consistency. The more uniform and consistent, and not only enforcement, but the overall implementation is, you'll have more consistency among designers, builders, manufacturers, suppliers, and you ultimately end up with a better enforcement and better end game of the provisions. So the modifications to the energy code by a city or county must include a cost justification, along with, at the top there, so there's local, climatic, geographical, and topographical reasons are the only things that they can do to make that modification. But if it's energy, if it's related to energy, then they also must include a cost justification. And again, those must be filed with the state once they're done, and they must go through the whole legal process of within the law. And the city or county establishes their effective date for their local amendments, but they cannot be prior to the effective date set by the state. So if, and we've seen this in the past where a local jurisdiction may want to modify a code, but yet they want to delay enforcement even further. So they may, the state code may take effect in January 1, but they delay their modifications for months or usually just months. Never a year, but I've seen some odd things happen at times. So basically, again, you're trying to get some sort of consistency there. So on the enforcement side of things, so the way the state works is, again, I mentioned local jurisdictions, local cities and counties. So they have jurisdiction over all private buildings. So if you want to come in and you want to build a high-rise building in any particular city, or a low-rise or a home, you go to your local building department for that city or county, that jurisdiction. And you get a permit and go through the whole process. However, for public schools in California, it doesn't matter whether it's within a particular city or county throughout the state. That is done by the California state architect. All the enforcement, they have a requirement by law that they actually have inspectors on site anytime work is going on, which is slightly different than the way the private local cities and counties operate. So local cities and counties, you have a building that's going through steps through the process, right? So you have your foundation, for example, to start with. So you maybe have slab edge insulation. And so the inspectors go out and they do that inspection at that time. They leave. They don't come back until they're called, let's say, for insulation inspection. Once the frame is up and everything and insulation is installed, they come back and check the insulation. And so it goes through that type of process. However, again, with public schools, the inspector is on site all the time. And one of the structurally, schools have to meet a higher level than typically private buildings. And hospitals are the same way. The hospitals have to maintain operation even in the event of an earthquake or hurricane or whatever may hit. And that enforcement is done by the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development, otherwise known as OSHPD, we call them here. And interestingly, though, on the energy side, they were not required to meet the state code until about 2 cycles ago, maybe 6 years ago. Before that, all hospitals or OSHPD was able to just enforce whatever they wanted to in relation to energy efficiency. But obviously over a period of time that they fall behind. So they had to pick up and again, back to the uniform and consistency issue. But hospitals obviously have air quality issues that are higher than most other buildings. So what does the state do at a statewide level? Again, state provides training to local jurisdictions. They really need to do that. There's actually a bill that provided funding back when I was there, probably 12 years ago, that actually provided funding for the state to provide the local jurisdiction training. They publish a list of all local amendments on the web, as I mentioned. The other thing is if a jurisdiction fails to enforce the code, so like I mentioned, you have a wide array of cities and counties with a large difference in terms of force, people that can do the work, people that are qualified to do the work. And sometimes they don't do the work. They just fail to enforce, especially when the energy code came out. It was the attitude was along many inspectors was, they were interested in enforcing the structural safety provisions of the building and didn't worry as much about the energy. And, California's had their energy code in place for 40 years. So we've had a lot of time to learn lessons and figure things out. But that's one of the issues that was a real problem for a while back in the 80s and even into the 90s. And that's where education and training came in. And that's where this, where the state can, if there's a problem where they're failing to enforce the code, the state can require a report from the jurisdiction to explain why or what's going on or how they would correct the issue. And if that report is inadequate, the state can actually assume enforcement to ensure that the codes are being enforced in the city or county. And they charge the jurisdiction to cover the costs. The other thing is the Energy Commission. We have an Energy Commission that can also audit local jurisdictions. As I mentioned earlier, there's a law specific to the Energy Code, and that brings the Energy Commission into play. And so when they can audit, and then you're back to that whole issue of back to taking enforcement. If they're failing to do what they should be doing, then the state can get involved. But generally, other than that, it's hands off. It's let the jurisdictions do their job, do what they want in terms of how they enforce it, just ensure it's enforced. And as far as speaking of enforcement, again, from a practical standpoint, I did it for 10 years, and the attitude is not so much of being a policeman. That's not the approach that most inspectors take. It's more of, hey, the builder's trying to build it right. The owner wants it built right. We're just there to help. So we're there to inspect, ensure that, hey, maybe they missed something, maybe they overlooked something on the plans, or they don't understand the code fully, and to help it get built right, because energy efficiency is obviously a major issue, as Mr. Norbert explained earlier. And in California, we have, I think it's 20% of our energy goes just to water use. So think about that. If you can save water on top of it, and that's why we have water provisions in our energy code in California as well, and even at the IECC. So ultimately, when it gets down to it, we're talking about a balanced regulatory system where you have, open development process, it's continuous. So in California, every 3 years, and in most of the states, although some are kind of taking a different approach, it's done but in California, it's like clockwork every 3 years. You get input from all interested parties. That's the only way things really work, is that collaborative effort, technical committees, and the final decision by government agency. Effective code implementations. You need support at publications. Again, back to that, providing understanding of what the code is. So you provide those supports, as I mentioned earlier, I heard earlier about the code and commentary and the essentials. Those are important documents to have. And in California, we actually have what we call a compliance manual, which is, I believe, for residential, it's about 1,200 pages and about 1,500 pages for commercial. But it really gives the diagrams and everything. It's quite a document and takes a lot of work to put together, but it's good. Of course, building inspection, education, training, certification, accreditation, and then building product evaluation. And that really comes down to in the codes, it allows for alternate materials and methods of construction. So, the code may say, hey, X is required for this particular provision to meet this requirement. However, somebody has developed something that is equivalent or even better than, and they'd like to use that instead. So the product can be evaluated, and then the local jurisdiction, the building official, can permit that use if it's equivalent or better than. And with that, thank you for participating today, and we'll do question and answers, I believe, at the end. And that's it for my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Walls. Man, you shared quite a bit of wisdom as the decades of experience that you've had, not only as a licensed contractor, but also being part of the development and the enforcement process of energy codes and codes in general. As we began this webinar and we were referencing some of what is happening in the US, and of course, when you heard from Mr. Omar, he spoke about the linkages with the International Code Council and the international presence that the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code has. And so in your presentation, when you would have referenced the state, so in our context in the Caribbean, the state would be the country itself, the entire country, and the respective jurisdictions throughout each country. So we can relate to what you're saying in terms of state-wise and the counties and the local jurisdictions in the region. Some similarities as far as the challenges with enforcement. Throughout the region, we have implemented building codes in general, and we are pretty much aware of some of the challenges, especially when it comes to enforcement, where there's a lack of equity in the code in terms of some are feeling that it's just beyond their reach. And so codes and implementation that is flexible, as you said, truly makes a big difference. So there are 2 or 3 questions. There are 3 questions in the chat. Let's just see if we could address them quickly. The first question from Mr. David Clark: how is the CARICOM Energy Code? How is the CARICOM Energy Code differs from that in North America and Europe? So I think, yes, David?
I was going to say, yeah, for me, I honestly, I'm not the expert on the Caribbean code, but I know there were modifications, and a lot of it has to do with climate zones, because obviously where I'm at in California, we don't have the nice tropical weather that you have down there. So, maybe Southern California a little bit, but where I'm at, Northern California, we have nice weather, but it's not the same. So, we get freezing weather here, and you don't have that, I don't believe, in the Caribbean. So, we have to have different provisions. In fact, California, we've broken our climate zones up into 16. We don't even follow the national one for California. So we have 16 climate zones. But as far as again, North America, because every state does sort of their own thing, similar to what you've done there. As I mentioned, California, we broke it up further. So that's going to be the primary differences, I think. And obviously the other difference is the metric system. We don't use the metric system in the US. And I deal with that a lot as I'm working with codes around the globe, because I don't think anybody uses our system, at least that I've come across. So that's going to be a difference too. So when you're dealing with sizing of different things, we may say, hey, we want to, 16 or 24 inches of insulation in the attic. Well, yours is going to be whatever the metric system is. But
yeah, absolutely. And you're spot on in terms of the differences. The primary areas, including the climate zones. So there are modifications in the existing CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code that are specific to our climate in this region.
Yeah.
So we don't have as many climate zones in the CARICOM region. We would have like 3 primary climate zones: climate zone 0, climate zone 1, climate zone 2.
Right.
And so you find that there are very few or much less climate zones in the CARICOM region. And in the code, you will find that that is definitely one of the differences. Another difference would be, for example, the use of vestibules in the region as far as demonstrating compliance with the code. So we could use vestibules in the absence of having the air curtains to seal off the buildings and to make the envelope a bit more tighter than the regular unit would be. So there are many modifications, and when you take a look at the code, you will find that the vertical, wherever you see the vertical lines, double vertical lines, this is an indication of what the regional project team did as far as making the necessary changes to make it an application document for the CARICOM region. So thanks for that question, David. And the next question we have: if and when something similar to this code is established in CARICOM, which body or authority or government agency would be responsible for enforcement of these policies? So I will just take a quick couple minutes just to answer this. We already have an established energy efficiency building code in the region, which is what we refer to as the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. And this code, as you heard from Mr. Omar, was approved by the government officials, the government energy ministers, in April of 2018. So we are now in our 3rd year of officially adopting this CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. Now, as far as the body or the agency that will be responsible for enforcement of these building codes, the national or local member states would now again take the responsibility of going through the implementation and what it is that each respective member state would like in terms of the enforcement. Are you first of all seeking to adopt the code as a national standard? So you create a soft entry, which is what we see most member states, especially even here in Antigua and Barbuda. In April of this year, we have adopted the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code as our national energy efficiency building code. We've adopted it as a national standard. So this would allow some level of flexibility as far as all the stakeholders to get a better understanding of the requirements. Things like the materials, are they available? And do we have the capacity? So as we continue to implement as a national standard, first of all, there will be many lessons learned as far as the responsible agencies as far as enforcement. But typically, if there are any agencies within your respective jurisdictions that are responsible for funding, for example, so they may want to play a part as far as the inspections, as far as the enforcement is concerned. And the third question, if and when something similar, well, that's a repeat of the first question. I think this one is from Ryan, and he said, if and when something similar to this code is established in CARICOM, which body, authority, government agency would be responsible for enforcement of these policies? Okay, and like I said earlier, member states are responsible for the implementation, and based on what the method you've used, whether it's been adopted as a national code or national standard where it's voluntary, then member states will decide the manner in which the process will go as far as responsibilities for enforcement. There's a question again from Miguel. Why hasn't CARICOM or OECS partnered in a joint carbon credit initiative instead of an individualistic approach by territory? Wouldn't a joint approach enable a block application for international carbon credits? So there are, and feel free, Dave, if you want to just jump in with some of the responses. So there are many opportunities in addition to the established energy efficiency building code for the CARICOM region. There are other stretch codes, stretch standards. This is just the base code. The CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code is referred to as a base code with minimum standards, but there are other activities that should accompany the energy efficiency building code, such as incentives like, as you said, carbon credits. But a lot of this would be, again, based on the member states deciding the route in which they would like to go. And the various institutions throughout the region, I know we have CREE here with us. There are other institutions that are also promoting and driving activities towards incentives and other programs, in addition to the Energy Efficiency Building Code. But it is a first and necessary step to have an Energy Efficiency Building Code established, and then the accompanying steps to follow. Okay, so at this point, we would like to move to the next presenter. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, and thank you very much, Mr. Walls, for your presentation.
You're welcome.
And you're most welcome.
Thank you.
So our next presenter is Dr. Gary C. Jackson. Dr. Gary C. Jackson is the Executive Director of the CARICOM Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, CREE. He is on a mission to increase awareness and development of the renewable energy and energy efficiency agenda within the CARICOM region. As CREE's Executive Director, Dr. Jackson leads the implementation of CREE's three main priority areas. These include creating an expert knowledge base, optimizing technological solutions through tool development, and transforming the region by utilizing sustainable energy as a means to advance the well-being of at-risk and vulnerable groups. The technical department is managed by Dr. Jackson. Appointed to the post in October 2018, Dr. Jackson holds a Doctor of Philosophy, a PhD degree in Mechanical Engineering, and a Master's of Science degree in Project Management, both from the University of Birmingham, the United Kingdom. He also holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. He is a registered engineer or professional engineer in Jamaica, a member of the Association of Energy Engineers, AEE, a Certified Energy Manager, CEM, and a member of the Society of Automotive Engineers, ASAE. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Jackson.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Norbert. Thank you, Mr. Wall, for your presentation, and thanks to CrossQ for this partnership. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to just take you through what we believe is a role for the CREE in the implementation of the CREEBC. Very important to this particular initiative is partnerships. One that has been forged with the CrossQ and other institutions across the region, and also our international development partners. We recognize that particular initiatives like these will require partnerships and focus. Something that is transformative and obviously is going to change attitudes that will need a number of convincing as it relates to adopting such a very important initiative. And as Mr. Norbert mentioned, the building is such an important part of the energy spectrum or the ecosystem of the energy sector. But what I'm going to do with you this morning is just speak to some elements of what we believe will be required for the implementation of the CREEBC. And from those elements, we will share with you what we believe CREE's role would be in some of those elements as we look towards transforming the energy landscape to one that is more sustainable, reliable, resilient, improving the lives of our people. So, you know, there is a model called the RASCE model, normally used in businesses. And we recognize that this model is going to be something that we will need to adopt as we look to implement the CREEBC or the REBEC, as Mr. Omar referred to it. We need to identify who will be responsible for what activities, or who will be totally responsible, the custodian, as CREEBC is for the building code, the energy efficiency building code in particular. Who will be the accountable officer or entity or institution nationally and regionally, and who provide the requisite support for the implementation of this particular initiative, and who will be consulted for this to happen. And obviously the information that we garner from this particular initiative, how that is going to be shared, what type of information or data is going to come out of it, so that the awareness across the region is consistent, the message is consistent, and we can sustain as well. And obviously, we have to implement. And in implementing, we need to monitor and evaluate that implementation to ensure that the impact is significant enough for the transformation that we did set for those ambitions that we set for ourselves. And I know a number of the countries have set very ambitious targets for themselves in relation to the energy sector, both on the energy efficiency standpoint and also for the renewable energy intervention. So I thought I would share with you those elements. Now, within that construct, we see CREE as providing information as it relates to data analysis that may emanate from some of the interventions that would take place. We also see ourselves as being consulted as it relates to the interventions that may be required for some of these activities within the code, and also providing support in some of these interventions as countries navigate their energy landscape going forward. We could play some parts in the implementation, that would depend on the requests that may come from our member states or from our partners, from our regional institutions in supporting those implementation activities. But I thought I would also want to share with you about the energy spectrum, because it's always important for us to understand where this all began and why we're doing what we're doing. As Mr. Norbert mentioned about the building, you know, you have to have a demand for us to know what it is that we are going to be doing. And that demand normally comes from building in the energy spectrum. Now, in the past, persons would have built their houses and they wouldn't have an electricity supply. They would normally use home sweet home lamps, kerosene lamps, or they may use candles, or they may just use the sunlight or the moonlight for them to have visibility. And typically they didn't have much economic activities as we have today to drive, from electricity to drive those economic activities by the use of electricity. So as we have advanced in our development of buildings, in particular, this one is a residential building, and Mr. Wall spoke about water, so I want to address the water thing because I think that is such an important part of our energy use across the region as well. You know, there are different components of this building. You will have trees around to help for shading, to reduce the heat gain on the house. And you know, what is important for us is to understand the local context. I mean, local context is very important. So we spoke about climate in relation to the difference between what we do in the Caribbean and what happens in North America, but also how do people interact with technology. The culture differences is also a very important thing to recognize. And our adoption to particular technologies for us to drive the change that we so seek. Now, typically our houses are built on a particular code for security and for resilience to climate change, in particular hurricanes and more recently, more volcanic eruptions in terms of seismic movements like what has happened in St. Vincent, and even earthquakes as what has happened in 2010 in Haiti. But we have mostly built our structures in that relations, but energy efficiency is such a critical part, because as we move to build up more buildings, we need energy to support that building. And we started by using fossil fuel, right? So as buildings were being built, we recognized we need electricity. So we needed to build what we call the infrastructure for electricity. So we needed to build pole lines, wires to connect to that load. But we want to ensure that there's a balance between the two to ensure that we are sustainable and climate resilient, and also to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So it is a very critical thing to not understand the system only on the demand side, but for us at the CREE, we have to understand the entire spectrum to ensure that the system is operating optimally, efficiently, to provide economic activity to improve the lives of our people. So moving from residential, you go into commercial. So, Mr. Wall and Mr. Norbert spoke about commercial buildings. You're talking about getting more sophisticated, although residential, we do that as well. We have light controls, in our smart technologies. We're talking about heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. Important to that is air quality. And as we look at more greenhouse gas emissions, it's important for us to improve air quality in our buildings, in particular with even this COVID crisis that we are facing. And we have to make sure we understand the distinction between keeping a building cool and improving the air quality inside that building. The plug loads, the window shading as it relates to our climate conditions. And that increases the demand on the system. So we want to make sure this demand, the supply can meet this demand. And if it can't, we need to increase the supply. So in our new dispensation, as we look at greenhouse gas emissions, we are now looking at renewable energy. So we decide to connect solar to the system. And then we look at wind. So we do a resource assessment. So we connect wind to the system. So each part of the system has an energy efficiency component to it. And we have to ensure that the system is optimally operating. But we know that there's intermittency in some of these areas. So the other part of efficiency that we have to consider in terms of conversion is including energy storage, which is another part of the energy efficiency spectrum. So we want to ensure the system is operating reliably and sustainably going forward. And then there was the advent of electric vehicles. So we have now added additional load. But the interesting thing about electric vehicles is that it operates on both sides of the spectrum, on the supply side and on the demand side. Again, the conversion efficiency is going to be important for us. So when we look at the building will now incorporate a number of these things that we have to ensure is efficient. And for this system to work accurately and properly, and for it to see what we are doing in the future, we need to add plans. So we need to ensure that we have the right plan to execute. And what we are doing is executing what we call an integrated resource and resilience plan to ensure that these buildings and these supply systems operate in a very synergetic way that will ensure that we are reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So codes operate in a very dynamic environment. And as Mr. Wall mentioned, they do a review maybe every 3 years. And understanding that dynamic environment, we have to address this through our consultation with the people. We have to have the discussions to ensure that the codes can be adopted and what are the local contexts. But we also have to train the practitioners, the users of energy to ensure that we have the right balance and also provide the right information. But we always also need to develop the right policies, and those policies have to be informed by the science, and it needs to be inclusive and be informative when we develop these policies. And then we need the right plan. So the CREE is operating in this space in particular, in supporting an integrated resource and resilience plan to ensure that the demand, in particular the building code, the energy efficiency building code, in particular, the demand analysis, understanding the demand side measures that needs to be taken place inside those systems to ensure that the supply can efficiently meet that demand. So that needs to be inclusive with our stakeholders and properly designed. And then from those plans will emanate projects. Projects are going to need collaboration, coordination for deployment. And that is why partnerships is important. And this is a principle that we have adopted at the CREE and have adopted within CARICOM. We call it the 5P principles. And we think through partnerships, we'll be able to monitor, evaluate, among other things, to support the energy transition through the codes that we are operating in. So outside of the energy efficiency building code, we have grid codes, we have codes for motor vehicles, and we want to ensure that they are operating in a collective and synergetic way. So, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time, and we look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson, for such an informative presentation. Lots of information for us to ponder on. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now move to the next presenter, our third and final presenter, Ms. Daika Straker. Ms. Daika Straker is an international trade and development analyst. She is a well-rounded professional with training in law, international trade policy, project management, and quality infrastructure. Her research interests are trade and development, trade and climate change, and policy implementation. She currently serves as a regional energy apprentice attached to the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, CREEBC. She has a keen interest in helping developing countries navigate international and regional markets by offering sound and strategic advice, data analysis, project management, and objective research. Hence, her chosen area of her presentation today. Under the TAPSEC Regional Energy Apprentice Program, Mrs. Straker is required to make a 15-minute presentation to show what she learned from the aspect of CREEBC's Energy Work Program, which has been impactful on her. She has shown a keen interest in the CREEBC, or the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, and has become an advocate for its implementation. From this perspective, she will be showcasing her research on international best practices for the implementation of the Energy Efficiency Building Code. Welcome, Mrs. Straker.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Norbert, for those wonderful words of introduction. So my presentation is based on project activities and research that I have done during my internship. I worked closely with the capacity building initiatives such as training for the CREEBC, which sparked my interest in its adoption and implementation. Now, as the REAP intern, I work in the CREEBC Energy Unit, whose work program involves promotion of their two energy efficiency initiatives. That is the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code and the Harmonized Regional Energy Efficiency Labeling Program. These are geared toward ensuring that the requisite quality infrastructure is in place to facilitate the development of the region's sector. Now, as I learned more about the CREEBC, I recognized how important it was for member states. If adopted and implemented, it would play a critical role in increasing energy efficiency. So I thought I would provide a detailed guide as to what planning for implementation entails. So my presentation today will cover international best practices for energy efficiency building code implementation, the issue of voluntary versus mandatory implementation, and how we can go about implementing the CREEBC. Now, the internationally recommended general pathway for energy efficiency code implementation is in 4 phases: plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate. This pathway was recommended by the International Energy Agency and the UNDP based on an extensive analysis of countries' experience with code implementation. The process is very flexible, and I must stress that it depends on your country-specific context. As is seen on the diagram on the screen, the cycle starts with creating a robust plan which guides implementation. Then the results are monitored and evaluated to provide insights for updating the code. Today, I will be focusing on the planning phase, but I'm also in the process of currently writing a research paper that looks in depth at the different phases, and this will be made available to you in a timely manner. Additionally, at CrossQ, I am exposed to initiatives that are geared towards assisting member states with implementation preparedness. So some member states have adopted the code and are at the stage of preparing for implementation. Therefore, it is necessary to understand how the best practices of successful planning guides a smooth implementation. Now, the objective of planning is to identify the necessary steps, the stakeholders, and the indicators for monitoring and evaluation. This planning process should be as rigorous and in-depth as possible so as to ensure that all bases are covered for compliance and enforcement and to reduce any barriers to full implementation. So one of the first steps in planning is to define the objective and adopt the objective, scope, and norms for the code. Firstly, it is necessary to ascertain the overarching policy framework that sets the principles and long-term goals based on country-specific priorities and international commitments. Subsequently, the current climate for implementation is assessed by conducting extensive stakeholder consultations, energy audits, and a regulatory impact assessment. And this will help to improve the legislative framework, energy policies, and strategies for implementation. And there are many other activities that could assist with gauging the climate for implementation. Next, define and adopt the necessary norms to set minimum energy performance requirements, establish baseline and reference points, and determine climate zone. Fortunately for us in the region, the CREEBC covers some of these requirements. For example, each member state's specific climate zone is identified, so you already have a head start. Step 2 is defining the modalities to support implementation. It begins by defining a clear efficiency governance structure, which will outline the responsibilities of the public sector, the private sector roles, and human resource capacity for enforcement and compliance. Now, the International Energy Agency states, and I quote, "It is critical to assign program responsibilities within the public sector and to allocate the financial and human resources needed for implementation," end quote. They also advise that these should be done as early as possible so each organization has a clear mandate and understand their role in implementation. Now, we come to the real serious part of planning, financing to support implementation. It is recommended that a sustainable funding mechanism should be obtained to support implementation. These funds would be used to run the robust and comprehensive administrative system needed for this process. And this includes, but not limited to, training, awareness campaigns, education of the general public, and a team to review and update the code. Just to note, the CREEBC intends to update the code every 6 years to ensure that it stays relevant and in line with international standards. So again, we have another head start. Now that we have defined the objectives and the modalities to support implementation, it is crucial to go one step further to develop supportive policies. And these policies and instruments are created to foster synergies. They include activities such as standard for energy efficient equipment and renewable technologies, labeling schemes for appliances, land use policies, etc. Another crucial instrument to support implementation are programs and incentives to support the usage of the energy efficient building code. These could be initiatives such as tax breaks, tax rebates, insurance discounts for usage of the code. And I know after we go through our planning stage, we can get creative with what other supportive policies we can put in place. Another international best practice in the planning phase is raising awareness of the code. Now, this is very critical to the effective implementation of the code, as stakeholders need an understanding of why the code is important, how it will affect them, and most importantly for the general public, how they can save on being energy efficient. The International Energy Agency notes that widespread understanding of the code and their benefits is known to increase public acceptance. The sensitization campaigns can take the form of raising awareness about energy usage, such as its impact on climate change, how to be energy efficient, and about renewable energy technologies and other issues. Efforts should also be targeted towards policy and decision makers, industry professionals, such as architects, engineers, developers, building occupiers, any stakeholder that the code will impact. Sensitization should be geared towards them. Now, another vital component of sensitization campaign is the education of industry professionals. This training should cover provisions of the code, compliance software, and the monitoring and evaluation indicators. At the end of the planning phase, a detailed action plan is required for full implementation of building energy code with a clear implementation strategy for each phase identified earlier. So the implementation action plan should be widely shared with stakeholders for feedback prior to its adoption. Now, I'm not an expert, but in my estimation, a good action plan for member states should cover the objectives and scope of implementation, a development plan for institutional capacity, a design of the mechanisms to support implementation, and a strategy for sensitization. And as I said earlier, the planning phase should be as robust and in-depth as possible. Now you have come to the end of the planning stage. One major question that you need to answer is, will implementation be voluntary or mandatory? From my research, this is an issue I recognize could be a conundrum if proper planning is not in place. Firstly, I would like to say both approaches have their merit. Nevertheless, the literature came to a clear conclusion that mandatory implementation is the most effective way to fully benefit from the code. From the map on the screen, we can see that the countries in green, including much of Europe, Russia, China, Mexico, and I'm most impressed, closer to home, French Guiana, have mandatorily implemented building energy code for new residential buildings. On the other hand, the countries highlighted in orange, namely Brazil, South Africa, India, have chosen to adopt a voluntary approach for building energy codes for new residential buildings. The USA, Canada, and Japan in yellow have used a more mixed approach, which is a combination of the two. So as I said earlier, each approach has its place. Another interesting method I observed was that parts of the code were made mandatory before other parts. For example, Tunisia's building energy code was developed in 2004. In 2008, it became mandatory for large office buildings. And in 2009, it became mandatory for single family homes. After updating the code, the new provisions came into effect for office and education buildings in 2011. However, the changes did not apply to social dwellings until 2012 and all other dwellings or all other building types until 2013. Now, more closer to home is Puerto Rico. And what I found unique to Puerto Rico is that they adopt the same International Energy Conservation Code from the ICC, which is the base code for the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. One of the most outstanding difference that I found though is that Puerto Rico used the 2009 version with amendments while we are using the 2018 version. And I just want to backtrack a little as I want to share about the progression of energy codes in Puerto Rico, just to demonstrate the fluidity of implementation. In 1979, the Code for Energy Conservation in Puerto Rico was adopted. Legislation had to be enacted that assigns Energy Affairs Administration responsibility for updating the Energy Code. On January 1st, 2011, the IECC 2009 version was adopted, but there was a transition period. In order to fulfill the 90% compliance as stated in the state's energy program regulation, it only became effective on the 1st of March 2013 through March 1st, 2016. And then the energy code was further updated in 2016. So we can see from these two examples that Tunisia and Puerto Rico recognize that a transitory approach would have been best for their country's context. Now, we as a region need to develop our own tailor-made game plan for ensuring effective implementation. So we know what the planning phase entails, and we have a few country examples. Let's put a game plan in place. Let's give maximum consideration to our region context and the challenges that we face. And since Olympics is happening, I'm using a sports reference to make it as relatable as possible. Specifically, I will be going through 2 football, soccer, for the Americans, game plans that gets us to scoring a goal, something the Liverpool fans would know nothing about. So on the field, we have solids that represents us, and the X's represents any challenges or barriers we could encounter in implementation of the code. Game plan 1 is a phased implementation. This first play is flexible and it gives you room for creativity. And as we just learned, mandatory implementation is the goal. So we know in football, you have a kickoff. So here, you would kick off with the basics by adopting the CREEBC as a national standard. As it is voluntary, this gives you a strong baseline to build from. And then after adoption as a standard, our next move could be to build institutional capacity. We follow this by developing the indicators for monitoring and evaluation. And as in football, these 2 steps are where the majority of the hard work is done. Now, at this point, we have made significant progress towards the goal, but we require a bit of creativity to put the ball in the back of the net. So we start work on sensitization of the local population, which puts us in the final third. The last step is to promote the use of the CREEBC by creating incentives which will put the ball over the line for mandatory implementation. And there you have it, we have a goal. We would have completed mandatory implementation through our phased implementation game plan. This play would be for those countries that don't have the capacity just yet to fully implement the CREEBC. So we'll take a transitory approach. Now, game plan number 2 is mandatory implementation. This play has the same final objective as game plan 1. But on the other hand, it allows us to build on existing frameworks and therefore require less resources and time. For example, in the case of Jamaica, who has a national building code in place, there would be no need to adopt the CREEBC as a national standard. Conversely, there would be a need to update their institutional capacity to recognize the provisions of the CREEBC. In addition, I would recommend that the next move in this play would be to refine existing indicators for monitoring and evaluation. Ingenuity and a well-thought-out strategy for sensitizing the local population and creating incentives to promote the use of the CREEBC are still vital to ensuring we reach our goal. And this game plan 2 play would be for those countries that have the infrastructure, capacity, and supporting policies already in place to fully implement the CREEBC. You will have to determine, after considering your country's context and readiness for implementation, which of these plans will work best for you. Or if you want to develop a third game plan, that will also be recommended. We know that in CARICOM, we are a team. We all have a role to play in making implementation of the CREEBC a success. The CARICOM Energy Unit and CrossQ got the ball rolling with the development of the CREEBC. It was customized to our particular climate and context. Dr. Jackson just outlined CREE's role in implementation. And there are other organizations, well, other regional organizations such as the CDF, which can play a role, such as providing funding. These other organizations could, I know that these other organizations at the regional level are making efforts to make the implementation of the CREEBC a reality. However, I think it must be said that implementation happens at the national level. Therefore, policymakers and regulators with the responsibility should make implementation of the CREEBC a priority. And as with any team, the responsibility for reaching our objective is a shared one. All stakeholders, bureaus of standards, Ministry of Planning and Development, local government, should take an interest in becoming advocates and doing our part to ensure that this becomes a reality. And I just want to end with this one note. Let's make the CREEBC's adoption and implementation a matter of national priority. I thank you for listening, and I now hand you back over to our very capable moderator, Mr. Norbert.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Straker. Man, you know, we have all of the comments in the chat, and we often told that an image says 1,000 words. And so for all of us, it's game time. So thank you very much for such a captivating and wonderful presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just about 24 minutes left for questions. So we actually saved all the questions for last. And what I will do at this time is to go through some of the questions that we have for the panelists. And we will start off with you, Mrs. Straker. There's a question that pertains to timing as far as the various game plans that you presented, or for that transition to take place. So the question is, realistically, how long do you think, or would you recommend the transition phase to be from start to finish in terms of transitioning from adoption to actual implementation? Would it be, and there's some suggestions, whether it would be 2 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years or more? What do you think?
I think a good setting a baseline period of 3 to 5 years would be good. But I honestly think that it depends on the country's context. And that is why an in-depth planning session or planning phase has to happen so we understand exactly where we are and where we need to go. So a baseline year of 3 to 5 years would be good. So it depends, on the country's context.
Okay, thank you very much for this answer. Our next question is, if training of practitioners is not being done in a country or at a country level, what can CREEBC or CREEBC do to assist member states if they are not getting that assistance from the respective national bodies? And this question is open. If Dr. Jackson would like to jump in at this time, feel free to do so. But yes.
Jump in quickly. Thanks for that, Mr. Norbert. So we have established the CARICOM Energy Knowledge Hub. You could actually register to that hub through the CARICOM Energy website or the CREEBC website. That particular hub has 3 areas of, well, 4 areas really, but the one that would be pertinent to that question would be the learning management system. So in that system, we have been uploading training in different areas within the energy space, from the demand side to the supply side. And I think that would be, and we have partnered with a number of institutions like CREEBC, the University of the West Indies, who is one of our thematic hubs. We have the Regional University Network, who is also a part of our ecosystem. And what we have asked them to do is provide us with information and training material to upload there so that participants across the region could, on their own time on demand, review those information or videos for their training needs. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. And it really ties into the 5 Ps that you spoke about in terms of the partnerships. Yes,
Hi, Mr.
Mrs.
Norbert.
Stricker?
I just wanted to comment on that question from the CREEBC arm. So I know that we've done training. We had a train the trainer activity where we trained industry professionals from the different member states. And this happened under 2 projects, or ESD project, and it also happened under our TAPSEC project. We also had another activity for it was called the inspectors training, and it was for code officials. And I know that these persons will play a part in the compliance of the code if adopted and implemented.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Straker, by highlighting some of the activities that CREEBC has undertaken as far as providing training opportunities for member states, because it all began with the contributions from organizations such as CREEBC in partnership as well with the International Code Council. So you would have heard from Mr. Omar when he gave us his opening remarks. He spoke about some of the publications, the Code Essentials, and the Study Companion. So in addition to the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, CREEBC has gone ahead and through the collaborative efforts with the International Code Council, they have also published the Study Companion and as well the Code Essentials. So member states and stakeholders within member states can go to the ICC website and access all of this information on the website. Okay, so let's move to another question. What is the approach for the stakeholder consultations? How many categories of stakeholders have been identified? And that's open to any of you panelists.
So I would like to take a first jab just before any of my esteemed panelists comes on. So based on my research, I realized that the Ministry of Energies, Ministry of Planning and Development and country authorities, bureaus of standards who are responsible for building the quality infrastructure, the utility companies also have a role to play. You have local government, which will have a role to play in compliance, monitoring, and evaluation. And then you have our industry professionals, who are the ones that will become contractors, those professionals that are a part of the building sector. I think the implementation of the CREEBC would all affect their work and their role. So I think those persons, I can't really categorize them, but I think those persons are all stakeholders. So therefore, I would recommend that we do like a stakeholder analysis, right? Where we assess what each institution, what role each institution play, right? What are their roles and responsibility, and how it will affect or support implementation of the CREEBC.
Thank you, Mrs. Straker. The stakeholder mapping is very important at a national level so that you can identify the stakeholders. And of course, Mr. Walls, if you would like to jump in at this time, sure.
Yeah, no, I think she did an excellent job of naming them. The only thing, and I'm not sure if I caught them all, but I think manufacturers and suppliers of equipment and materials are also critical stakeholders. You want to be able to ensure that that they can provide, what the code requires. So I think you want to include that, and ultimately, you want all interested parties, which is going to be the local public as well, which is going to be your building owners and homeowners and people that want to provide input. It affects their daily lives. It affects what they cost, or what their efficiency or energy costs are. So those are important too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Mr. Walls, for your contribution here. There's another question here. What is the energy benefit of having light-colored exterior walls in buildings? What is the energy benefit of having light-colored walls, exterior walls in buildings? Any one of you would like to address this question?
Mr. Norbert, I think this is right up your alley. I think you would be best placed to answer this question.
Okay. All right. Well, as you know, the light-colored walls. Let's think about, first of all, the black body effect. So when you look at, for example, the solar panel that's very black in color, what that solar panel would do, it would attract a lot more heat. So if you look at a light-colored exterior wall, the benefits would be that the solar heat gain coefficient of that wall would be a lot less than a darker wall. So lighter walls would attract less heat, and so the impact on your cooling loads would be less. So for example, if your roof is a dark color compared to a lighter color, there are matrices that are used to show you the direct benefits of using light colors as opposed to darker colors. So just think about the black body effect, and that will give you some sort of an indication as far as the amount of heat that the blacker colors would attract as opposed to lighter colors. It's a very simple way of actually being more efficient as far as the solar heat gain coefficient and the impact that this solar heat gain coefficient can have on cooling loads. So there are energy benefits where that is concerned. I'm not sure if I...
Yeah, I would like to add to that, Mr. Norbert, that the lighting of a room is also of importance here. So depending on what the room is used for. So if you're in a study where you need a lot of lighting, you could actually reduce, in particular in the daylight, you can actually reduce the amount of light energy from the electricity for that room if the colors are light. The darker the room, the more lighting you would need, especially if you're in a room that doesn't have enough windows that would allow enough light to get into the room, which we typically see in a number of houses in the Caribbean. So lighting is also important for us to reduce that energy. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. Very well said to make the connections between lighter colors, because some rooms that are even painted lighter colors may appear to be larger. So if you're in a very confined space and you've painted this room in a light color, then it appears to be larger as well. And of course, there will be a tendency to use less energy for lighting in such a space. Okay, so there's another question here. What is being done regarding the environmental and social impacts of the materials that will be used for the buildings? What is being done for the environmental and social impacts of the materials? So I know we look at the performance of the building itself, but as far as the environmental and social impacts of the materials that have been used for buildings, what is being done as far as this is concerned? I know it's a bit outside of the scope of what we're discussing today, but if any one of you would like to just respond to this question. Mr. Walls?
Yeah, I mean, it is. You don't see it much in the energy code, but you do in green codes, for example. So our International Green Construction Code, or Cal Green, which I mentioned earlier, it establishes requirements for building materials to be either recycled or recyclable, that type of thing. There's also other requirements that you put on manufacturers to use certain materials. You know, some of the stuff gets very difficult, but you know, when you get to concrete, because concrete has a huge carbon effect, but you can use fly ash or other fill material to a certain percentage to help offset that. Those are some of the methods that are used that I'm aware of, and there's calculations you can use in terms of, you know, what percentage of the building has to have X amount of recycled material again, or recyclable material, not just the individual products themselves as well, but you can look at the whole building effect as well, and require a percentage of it. And you know, that's probably, and then waste management, of course, that's the other piece of what do you do with the materials that's either left over or wasted, or during deconstruction. You know, how do you deal with that? So those are the main things I can think of right off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that contribution. Dr. Jackson, would you like to add to this?
Well, I think Mr. Wall has said it. I think in the Caribbean, though, we have some work to do in relation to how we use building materials and how we recycle it. It's a conversation we have been having in the region in terms of our waste management systems, and in particular, the type of recycling we can actually do to put back into the construction industry. But I think that is an area we need to provide some focus on to ensure that we can improve our sustainability. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. And also, we would have noted that some member states have already gone ahead into more ambitious codes, more ambitious standards by utilizing the LEED program for buildings. In Antigua and Barbuda, we have our very first LEED certified building that was built in a protected area. So in addition to the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, which really is the minimum or the base code, member states have already started throughout the region taking more ambitious steps towards LEED certified buildings. And a lot of this would be captured, as you said, Mr. Walls and Dr. Jackson. The LEED certified buildings would capture the whole impact assessment as far as the environmental impact of the materials. Okay. So there's another question here. What happens if a CARICOM country does not implement the code? Is there a timeline for implementation? Any one of you?
Well, I'd like to take a jab. Okay, so I think if the country choose or does not implement the code, they miss out on the benefits of the provisions of the code. The code was developed by experts from across the region, and it had or specific context in mind, right? So if you don't implement it, you just don't get the benefits of the code. Now, the timeline for implementation, as I said in my presentation, implementation happens at the national level. So the national authorities responsible for implementation would have to determine what the timeline is for adoption and implementation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Straker.
Additionally, I would like to say, though, that here at CrossQ, we have an initiative that we're working on called an implementation roadmaps that we are working on, doing like country situation analysis to give them an idea of where they are in the implementation phase, what they need to do. And this can assist them with determining what timeline it is that they need for implementation.
Okay, thanks for sharing this information, and our participants are receiving quite a bit of information as far as what is already in place to assist with the implementation and the support and the partnerships that have been formed to facilitate this implementation. Okay, so we have just about 9 more minutes left, and we have time for just a few more questions. So there's a question here. Would it be wise for the CARICOM member states to seek funding from donor agencies or the first world developed countries to implement this code to the extent that it has compliance? So would it be wise for member states to seek funding from donor agencies or first world developed countries to implement the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code? So, Dr. Jackson, do you want to?
I would try. I think the source of fund, it's not a bad idea, but I think one of the things about implementation is ownership. Countries need to take ownership of these initiatives, and with ownership, you need to have skin in the game, as they say. As I was looking at the analogy that Mr. Stryker put on the table in terms of the game plan, when you look at how you get that goal, a lot of it is going to be through leadership. You're going to need a captain of that team. Maybe not Liverpool, but maybe another team. But you're going to need a captain, and you're going to need to ensure that you understand your ecosystem, as Mr. Stryker mentioned about the local context. But even the Ministry of Finance could look at different functions of how they could create incentives to create fiscal space for these adoptions to happen, and also donor funding. But I think it might be a diversified strategy that needs to be implemented for you to have an effective change. We don't need to have skin in the game, though. We definitely need to have skin in the game. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. Very well said in terms of the taking responsibility at a national level for the implementation, and of course to provide the necessary funding and incentives to stakeholders as they seek to implement. In addition to what we're discussing here, we know that all member states are in the process of updating policies, updating energy policies, updating the nationally determined contributions. And so in the process, they are also seeking funding as well to be able to implement some of the measures to demonstrate compliance, or that they have met the commitments of their respective commitments that they have made under the Paris Agreement. So skin in the game definitely is necessary for making it possible. Mrs. Straker, would you like to add something to that?
Not really, but definitely based on the fact that in the Paris Agreement, developed countries have also made commitments to assisting developed countries have made commitments to assist developing countries with their climate change commitments. So I think if it is in your country's best interest, I do recommend seeking funding from developed countries.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Also,
Very
I
well
just want to
said.
note that there are organizations within the region that has funding, put aside to assist with renewable energy and climate change initiatives for Caribbean countries. So I think we could take a look at what these requirements are and see if we can get some funding to assist as well.
Mhm. Very well said. Mr. Walls, would you like to add something to this question from an international or from a developed country?
No, I think it's a great idea to look at funding, but I think Dr. Jackson and Mrs. Straker said it well. You do need to take ownership, but that, if you get funding, it could be used to provide incentives to help fund, let's say, solar panels or some other items. Also not just. So it depends on what you're using the funding for. I think sometimes has an impact as well.
Mhm. Thank you very much. Funding is always popping up as one of the first questions when we speak about implementation. And awareness is very good so that member states are aware of what's going on at the country level in terms of what strategies are being used to seek funding. Just to share some information in terms of what member states have been doing, they have identified the adaptation and mitigation measures to be taken in order to address the question of climate change. And we have identified the cost of taking those mitigation and adaptation steps. So the implementation of the Energy Efficiency Building Code is in itself an adaptation step / mitigation in buildings in particular. And so many countries have designed projects to attract grant funding to assist member states with the implementation of these projects. So the implementation of the Energy Efficiency Building Code is another example in terms of demonstrating the adaptation or mitigation steps and being able to attract the necessary funding to do so. But that's a very, very good question. And I think it takes us to the point when I am about to hand over to Mrs. Banham, who will take us through the closing remarks. But before I go, I just want to say that we just have one question coming in for Mr. Walls. Okay, we could probably fit that in quickly. Mr. Walls, the Caribbean, and in particular CARICOM member states, is the lifetime friend and neighborhood. Now that the US is back in the game, please use your good office to set up to set us up. All right, that's just a special request to you in terms of being back in the game, so to speak.
Yeah, and we do. We look at the Caribbean definitely as our neighbors and our partners and friends, and so we've actually we do a lot of stuff down there, a variety of things, even with the World Bank has gotten us involved in some products or projects as well. So, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, as Mr. Omar spoke about the partnerships that have been formed with the ICC, I am also a member of the Commercial Review Committee for the 2024 International Energy Conservation Code. So quite a lot of partnerships and engagements as far as the developed world and the developing countries are concerned. So thank you. So at this point, I will hand over to Mrs. Banhan, who will take you through the closing remarks. So thank you very much, panelists, and it's all yours, Miss Banhan.
Thank you very much, as usual, Mr. Churchill, for leading us through and moderating this session. I just want to say as well, thanks to the CrossQ CEO, Mr. Derek Omar, who would have brought early results. Thanks to each of the panelists, Dr. Jackson, Mr. Walls, Mrs. Straker, for your participation in today's event and for the information you would have shared, for the questions that you would have answered. We really, really appreciate your involvement in this session. We at CrossQ, we would like to say a special thank you as well to all of you, our guests online, who would have stayed with us for the last 2 hours. As you would have heard, there's been quite a bit of work that has been done towards the implementation of the CREEBC. Mrs. Straker would have mentioned that we would have been training professionals that we're hoping within our region will train others in the provisions of the code. And we've also initiated training of the inspectorate as well. And we are really, really encouraging those who've been trained to really utilize your new skills for the region and in your respective countries. There will be an increasing demand for qualified persons as countries start to adopt and implement these codes, both in construction as well as the National Inspectorate. And we'll need you as professionals to help guide us in terms of the informed decisions that we'll need to make in terms of the provisions of the code. So there has also been certification of the inspection and inspectors and code officials, and we definitely like to see more qualified professionals actually certified to inspect buildings to the 2018 CREEBC. This will be critical. This will be a critical aspect really for compliance as we implement, and we invite those who are interested to inquire at your national bureaus and show your interest so that we at the regional level also know, what we need to do to aid where we can and what the national level also needs to do in terms of assisting in the certification and getting professionals up to scratch as far as the code is concerned. We further also encourage CARICOM countries to adopt this regional code as a national instrument so we can really begin the process of implementation. The fact remains that even though we are seeing the impacts of climate change in our region, we are seeing stronger hurricanes, flooding, loss of utilities as a result of the trickle-on effects. The CREEBC is one way to mitigate the environmental impact through the use of less fossil fuels to generate electricity, and certainly the efficient use of our existing systems and infrastructure. And as part of a suite of building codes, the CREEBC will assist in building resilience against these increasing threats. Apart from the need for adoption, we also appeal to policymakers among us to make the necessary shift to implement measures like the code that can help our region be more resilient and sustainable in our energy use. The code can be a pivotal response to the issues of increasing global carbon footprints due to the unsustainable energy generation. And finally, we urge you all to also remember we are developing regional energy efficiency and minimum energy performance standards for electrical appliances for national adoption. These standards for lights, refrigerators, air conditioners, PV panels, and solar water heaters will go hand in hand with the code to create an all-inclusive approach to building sustainably. Your presence here today has demonstrated your interest, and we urge you to take up the charge for the betterment of our region as a whole, and your countries in particular. Stay tuned to CrossQ and CREE's social media channels and websites for information that can help in your thrust to educate and sensitize yourselves on the issues and how you can play a part. We really thank you for joining us, and we thank as well the TAPSAT project for sponsoring these series of webinars, and as well as for the work that they're also doing in terms of the roadmaps that Mrs. Straker would have mentioned and other aspects of the project. We really, really thank you, and please have a great remainder of your day.
The CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code was developed to help property developers increase the energy efficiency and the upgradability of their building projects. Energy savings help offset the potential higher cost of building your home to code. And enhanced upgradability helps commercial owners increase their competitive advantage, saving money over time. Additionally, lower energy demands during and after the building process can also lead to community and national level benefits like reduced reliance on fossil fuel generated electricity across the construction industry and in homes, lower national fuel import bills, which can free up funding for other critical areas of investment, and fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So do the maths, play the long game, and help build towards a better future today. For more information on the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, visit energy.crosq.org.